Today I'm going to show you how the intervalometer works on the A7 III and the A7R III. Finally, Sony have given us a built-in intervalometer in their cameras. I had a chance to go and test it this week. I took over 10,000 images and I've learned a lot about how it works. If you don't need to know what all the settings are, but you want to know how to shoot a time-lapse, go to this time code. This will take you to how I shoot a time-lapse with this built-in intervalometer. First of all, you need to find it. It's in tab 1, menu 4 of 14. Interval shooting. This is where you turn it on and off. If you have this on, whenever you press the shutter button, you start shooting a time-lapse sequence. When off, your camera takes photos as normal. Shooting start time. This is how long a delay you want at the start of your sequence. I don't want any shake induced to any of the shots that I take, so I set this to 2 seconds. You can set it all the way up to 99 minutes and 99 seconds. This is a really good function if you don't want to start the time-lapse straight away. You have up to an hour and 40 minutes to wait before it starts. Maybe you're out camping and the Milky Way isn't quite in the right place and you want to do a sequence of the Milky Way moving through the sky. All you have to do is set this to the time that you want it to start, and then it'll count down and start the time-lapse at that point. It does show a countdown timer on the back of the camera. It also disables the sleep function. So if your battery's running low, you might not get the whole time-lapse. The best thing for this is to have an external power source or have your battery on 100%. The other option is to switch to EVF, so it's saving a little bit of power by not having the monitor on. Shooting interval. This is the time between the start of one shot and the start of the next shot. So if you have a shutter speed of 1 second and an interval of 2 seconds, the shutter will stay open for 1 second, pause for 1 second, and then take the next shot. So the overall time from the start of one shot to the start of the next shot is 2 seconds. This does get overridden if you're in manual mode and your shutter speed is longer than the interval time. Also, in the semi-automatic mode, if your shutter speed goes longer than the interval time, this will get overridden unless you switch on a function in the next menu page, which I'll talk about shortly. Number of shots. This does exactly what it says. This is the number of shots it will shoot before it stops. I keep this at 1500, which normally gives me way more than I need, and also if I want to stop the time-lapse, I can do it at any time by pressing the shutter button a second time. This is good if you want to shoot a time-lapse and you're not going to be with your camera whilst it's shooting the time-lapse. You set the number of shots that you want in your final sequence and let it shoot the sequence. Then it'll automatically stop and the sleep mode will kick in once the time-lapse sequence is done. This will potentially save you battery power, and then you can come back to your camera afterwards and set another sequence. AE tracking sensor. This is a really interesting function and the one that I've been most interested in. You have 3 settings: low, medium, and high. I've tried it on low and high, and I haven't shot with medium. The only reason why I've shot in low or high on this setting is that I want to see what the setting produces and what it does on the extremes. I'll go into this setting in more detail once I've gone through the rest of the menu settings. At the bottom, you can see it gives you the overall time it will take to shoot the time-lapse. I'm so used to getting my calculator on my phone out that I've missed this a few times. It's great because it gives you an instant time of how long you'll have to wait for the time-lapse to complete all of the shots. Silent shoot in interval. This is where you can set the time-lapse to shoot in silent mode without having to find the silent shoot function elsewhere in the menus. I'd keep this on unless you have LEDs or fluorescent lights in your shot. This function is also good if you want to shoot incognito. If you set your camera up, set focus and switch it to manual focus, and then switch this function on, as well as switching to EVF, then it doesn't look like your camera's doing anything and it'll be completely silent. A couple of times I set the camera up like this and played on my phone. When a security guard came and asked me what I was doing, I told him I was just waiting for a friend. Because the camera didn't look like it was taking any shots, or it wasn't making any sound like it was taking photographs, the security guard left. So I got a couple of sequences that I normally wouldn't have been able to get with a DSLR. Shoot interval priority. This took me a while to figure out, but it's basically where you can tell the camera to give priority to either the exposure time or the interval time. It only works in the semi-automatic and automatic modes. If you're shooting in aperture priority or program mode, and let's say you have an interval time of 2 seconds, if it starts to get dark, your shutter speed will start to lengthen. If you have this set to on, your shutter speed will get to 2 seconds and then it will stay at this shutter speed. The shutter speeds won't get any longer. If you have this setting turned off, the shutter speed will continue to get longer and longer. This will increase your actual interval time to whatever the shutter speed is. I did it in this time lapse, and as you can see towards the end everything speeds up. I think I've finished with a shutter speed of about 30 seconds in this sequence. So back to auto exposure tracking sensitivity. I went down to the Burj Khalifa and shot a quick sequence of the fountain display. One in the high auto exposure tracking sensitivity and one in the low setting. To be honest, I didn't notice much of a difference with these two time lapses. I think this function would come into play more if you were shooting on a partially cloudy day when there was quite a bit of wind about. If the sun is coming in and out, your exposure on your shot will change quite a bit. If you have this setting on high, you'll probably get a bit of flicker. If you have it set to low, it may control this a bit better. One other thing I've tried with this setting is a day to nighttime time lapse. You normally get steps in your sequence as the exposure changes. This is normally due to the aperture opening up, your shutter speed lengthening, or the ISO increasing. I have shot a few of these day to nighttime time lapses before, and I've had to use a program called LR Time-lapse. What this does is iron out the steps as your exposure changes. So what I did was try some day to night time lapses. I've tried a few on the low setting, and I've tried a few on the high setting. I was quite surprised by how the camera handled this exposure change so well. There are a few little jumps in the exposure, but nothing major, which was really surprising. I was quite surprised the high setting didn't really change the exposure that much. I thought it would be jumping around quite a bit more. Although in this sequence that I'm shooting, there aren't any clouds or any direct sunlight, therefore the exposure just gradually drops. From shooting these sequences, if you are shooting a day to nighttime time lapse, I'd suggest keeping AE track sensitivity on low. I also shot a day to nighttime sequence of the Burj Khalifa. This was really tricky as when the sunlight dropped, the shots to the right of the frame became really bright and overpowered the whole shot, as well as the lights in the fountain display. But it is quite interesting to see that the exposure didn't jump around too much and it's actually a usable sequence. So there's definitely a potential to shoot day to nighttime time lapses with this camera and with the built-in intervalometer. I would put it through LR time-lapse just to iron out those little jumps in exposure, but it is a usable sequence. So if you want to shoot a time lapse, this is what I suggest. Start by doing one in the middle of the day or when the light is even and the exposure won't change too much. Set your camera up as you normally would taking a shot and make sure it's on a tripod. All good time lapses need a perfectly still camera. There's a rule called the 180-degree rule which you need to take into consideration. This will give you natural looking motion blur. If you want to learn more about the 180-degree rule, click on the eye in the corner. This will take you to a video explaining this. All you need to do is work out what your interval is and then half that for your shutter speed. So for example, when I'm shooting a time lapse with a 1 second interval, my shutter speed will be half a second. If I'm shooting with an interval of 2 seconds, I'll set my shutter speed to 1 second. Anything over 1 second and any kind of car movement or people moving in the shot tends to start to disappear. So I'll only go longer than this when picking up car light streaks or doing astro time lapses. When you're doing this in the middle of the day, you'll need an ND filter. Once your camera is set up, go to Menu tab 1, page 4 of 14. Set interval shooting to on, shooting start time to 2 seconds, shooting interval to whatever you decide. I'm on 2 seconds here. With time lapses, if I'm shooting fast moving clouds, people or cars moving through the shot, I'll tend to keep the interval to 1 second. If I'm shooting slower moving clouds, moving water or anything like that, I'll shoot it at 3 to 6 seconds. If I want to shoot shadows moving, or say the sun going through my frame, I'll keep it to about 10 seconds. This does all come down to personal preference, what you like and what you want to show in the shot. A time-lapse generally shows movement that you actually can't see with your eye, movement that you want to speed up, or where you want to show the passing of time. With the number of shots, you can set this to about 300, which will give you about 10 seconds of finished footage at 30 frames a second, or 12 seconds of footage at 25 frames a second. As I've said before, I set this to 1500, so if something interesting is happening at the end of the sequence, I can carry it on until that thing has passed. I then press the shutter button to stop the sequence. With the auto exposure tracking sensitivity, if you're shooting in aperture priority or program mode, or any of the other automatic modes, I'd suggest setting this to low. With the silent shooting mode, I'd switch this to on unless you have fluorescence or LEDs in your frame. With the shoot interval priority, I'd keep this to off as well. Now that you have the intervalometer switched on, you'll notice on your monitor or in your EVF, you'll have these two extra bits of information. The top one is the interval that you've set, and the bottom one is the number of shots taken and the number of shots to go. All you need to do to start your time-lapse is press the shutter button. If you set a delay like I have, it'll say stand by, shooting will start shortly. It also says you can exit shooting by pressing the shutter. This is just telling you to stop the sequence at any time. You can press the shutter button again. Throughout the sequence, it puts up the message, interval shooting will shoot shortly. Now this is a tongue twister, and I think this is a message that shows up if you have a really long interval. Maybe to remind you that you're shooting a time lapse. It did pop up every now and then, and I was wondering whether the buffer was filling, and that's why it was putting the message up, because it was increasing the interval. But this wasn't the case. It hasn't affected any of my time lapses. It just randomly pops up this message every now and then throughout your time lapse sequence. Once it started taking the sequence, you need to leave your camera alone completely. Don't touch it, don't kick the tripod, don't do anything to it. Otherwise your time-lapse sequence will be ruined. The thing with time-lapse sequences is to keep the camera perfectly still. So leave it alone until it's shot the sequence. Normally when you shoot a time-lapse with an automated lens where the aperture closes down and opens up automatically through the electronics of the camera, you do get a slight flicker in your time lapses. And this is basically because the aperture opens up so you can see through the viewfinder, and then when you take a shot, it closes down. It takes a shot, opens back up, closes down, takes another shot and opens back up. Now with all this movement, you get minute changes with the aperture hole. So therefore you get a slight flicker through a time lapse. Now with this built-in intervalometer, it closes the aperture down and keeps it there through the whole of the time lapse. So there's no change in the aperture, therefore you won't get this aperture blade flickering in your time-lapse sequence. And this is really good. Also, the focusing will do the same. You'll half press your shutter button, get focus, and then when you start the interval, it'll keep the same focusing point throughout the whole sequence. With other cameras that I've used for shooting time lapses, I've noticed that it gets focus on every shot. So this is definitely a bonus. I've also got a few other tips for you when you're shooting time lapses. I do turn off IBIS, but I don't have to. This is more of a habit from when I used to shoot with Canon cameras. As I've already mentioned, always shoot your time lapses from a tripod and don't touch the camera until the sequence is completed. If the exposure is going to stay around about the same, put it on manual mode and dial in your settings in that mode. If you're not sure how to dial in your settings in manual mode, click on the eye in the corner. This will take you to my shooting in manual mode video. Make sure you have enough memory so the camera can complete the sequence. You can set your aspect ratio to 16:9, but I prefer to keep it on 3:2 so I can change the framing just slightly while editing. If you are shooting in 3:2, just think about the 16:9 crop when you're working out your composition. Now that you've completed your time-lapse sequence, you'll have to process it to turn it into a video. I'll quickly cover the editing process now, but for a more in-depth time-lapse editing video, click on the eye in the corner. This will take you to another of my videos. Unfortunately, the Sonys don't compile the time-lapse in camera. So to make a time-lapse sequence, you'll have to edit all of these shots together. So once I'm back home, I'll import all of my images into Lightroom. Then I'll make any changes I need to the first image in the sequence. The main change I make is to the aspect ratio. Here I'll crop and change the framing to 16:9. Once I've made all the changes and I'm happy with how that first image looks, I'll sync all of the settings across all of the sequence. This is so all of the shots have exactly the same settings. If you have major exposure changes throughout your sequence, you might have to use the program LR Time-lapse. But that's more advanced editing and beyond the scope of this video. I didn't have to use LR Time-lapse for any of the sequences in this video, so you probably won't have to either. If you're interested in LR Time-lapse, I've left a link in the description. It really is a great program for really ironing out any exposure steps or changes in your time lapses. I normally compile my sequences in After Effects, but if you have the basic photo package, you can also do it in Photoshop. So in Lightroom, make sure all of the images are selected, click on File and Export. This will bring up your export window. I have Choose Folder Later. This means I just choose the location at the end. Then I have Custom Name and Sequence. I'm going to call this Metro Time-lapse, and then I'll make sure Start Number is on 1. I'm going to export them as JPEGs. I'm going to set my long edge to 1920, and this means it's going to be HD resolution. I'm going to turn off output sharpening, and then I'll click on Export. This is where I'll choose the location. I'm just going to put it in a folder on my desktop. Again, I'll call this Metro Time-lapse, and then I'll click on Open or double click the folder. Then all I need to do is wait for them to export. Once you've done that, open Photoshop, find the location where you put them, and click on the first image. Then click on Options and make sure Image Sequence is selected. Then click on Open. Here it'll give you your frame rate options. The normal ones are 24, 25 or 29.97. I normally shoot in 25 frames a second, so this is the one I'm going to select. Then I'll click on OK. As you can see, it's opened up the sequence in this timeline window at the bottom. If I click on play, it'll preview the time lapse. It won't be as smooth as the final sequence, but you'll have an idea of how the time lapse is going to look. Next, click on this little arrow down in the bottom left-hand corner, and this will open up the render video window. In this window, you can name your MP4 file. Once again, I'm going to call this Metro Time-lapse, and I'm going to select the location. I'll put it on my desktop again and click Choose. Here you can choose the format of video and the size of video. I'm going to export as a high quality H.264. My resolution is going to stay at 1920 by 1080. Everything else is okay, and I'll click on Render. Then I just have to wait for it to export. And this is the rendered MP4 file. As you can see, it's a lot smoother than the preview in Photoshop. As I've already said, if you want a more in-depth tutorial on editing time lapses, click on the eye in the corner or the link in the description. One thing that an external intervalometer still has over this built-in intervalometer is the remote shutter release. So if you shoot really long exposures, you'll still need to bring along your external intervalometer or a remote shutter release. And it is strange to see how cameras still have this 30-second limit on exposure times. I'd love to see a function built in where you can set your exposure time to exactly what you want it. So if you're taking a long exposure shot of 2 minutes, it'd be great to be able to set that to 2 minutes. For the time being, we'll still have to use remote shutter release cables for longer exposures than 30 seconds. The other downside to using this built-in intervalometer is that it doesn't compile the time-lapse in camera. So you'll have to wait to when you're back home or when you've edited the time-lapse together on your computer. I know some other cameras like the GH4 and the GH5 will compile the time-lapse in camera if you want to. This means that when you're on location, you can see a preview of the time-lapse before you get home. So if you've made any mistakes, you can change it and shoot another time-lapse before leaving the location. And that's about it. I think this is a really great addition to this camera. As well as using S&Q to shoot quick grab-and-go time-lapses, we've got the option of shooting much higher quality time lapses. If you've had the opportunity to use this built-in intervalometer, let me know how you got on in the comments below. It'll be great to see how you've got on with it and the sequences that you've produced. As always, if you like what you see, give me a thumbs up. If you didn't, give me a thumbs down. And for weekly tutorials, hints and tips in photography and videography, subscribe and turn on notifications. I'll see you in the next one.